Hello again. Today's class is wrapping up all the bits and pieces that we've gathered together to try and understand the state system. So what we'll do is look at Bob Jessop's chapter called The Concept of the State from his book, State, Past, Present and Future, which came out just a few years ago. So here it is, chapter 2, The Concept of the State. It is hard, he says, some claim impossible to give a clear definition of the state when this form of political organization has so long a history, assumes so many forms and changes so often. So we've already seen the difficulties on trying to understand the state. These issues call into question the descriptive validity and normative power of the state idea, and especially invites questions as to whether it obfuscates, fetishizes, or mystifies political power. Even assuming that there is an it to which state theory refers is problematic. So this is a recurring theme in this module, and I wanted to try and say that I'm not alone in saying this. There's a long history of scholars in the political sciences who've been talking about the difficulty of trying to define a concept that we've taken for granted. I've been bringing up this name from time to time, Philip Abrams, and Jessop brings him up early in this essay as well. He says a different response is indicated by the British historical sociologist Philip Abrams, who, without engaging directly or indirectly with Cioran, the person he talks about earlier, seems to turn his claim on its head. He suggests that if the state is a facade, Abrams calls it a mask, this does not disguise a void, but prevents us from seeing the true and awful reality of political practice. Right? A false belief in the existence of the state as the deep structure of political life masks the actual role of substantive political institutions and practices in securing domination. In the next section, Jessop describes Abrams' paper using the same subheading as his title, Notes on the Difficulties of Studying the State. And he says the state has been studied from many different entry points. This gives its analysis the contested qualities for which it is renowned or notorious, depending on one's perspective. It's a complex ensemble, or as some scholars put it, assemblage of institutions, organizations, and interactions involved in the exercise of political leadership and in the implementation of decisions that are in principle collectively binding on its political subjects. These complexities have led some analysts to focus on particular cases and ignore general questions about statehood and state power. So state power and statehood, rather than the state as an abstract entity, is what we're all now moving towards.
In this detour, I felt it was important to go over some of the basic concepts that make up the idea in this module. So I'm just going to read through this. What is politics? Politics is the process by which groups of people exercise authority, power, and influence to reach specific ends that are binding on the groups. And it's also sometimes called the art of negotiating the inevitable conflicts among various I's or individuals in order to achieve something of importance, not value, for the collective we. And another way of thinking about this is that power and conflict, those are essential features of politics. And we need to understand why that is so. The politics can also involve several features. One is making decisions, making non-decisions, but shaping agendas. And that's sometimes called the influential role of politics. And over longer periods, shaping preferences, also known as hegemony. Again, terms that we have come across in our readings. Politics involves taking sides, but each side has its arguments, reasons, and starting points. Political thought or philosophy aims to elucidate and evaluate them for their reasoning and content. So a large part of what we shall be doing in this course and in other courses involving political philosophy is to reason around political decisions, non-decisions, questions of influence, hegemony, etc. So the political theorist Sheldon Wolin suggests that politics is typically associated with three features: One, a struggle for competitive advantage between groups, individuals, or societies. Two, an activity driven by relative scarcity and changing circumstances. Three, an activity whose outcome could significantly affect a whole society or a substantial portion of it. So where does one find politics? And again, this is a recurrent theme. It's pretty much everywhere, or potentially everywhere, in families, schools, apartment complexes, university campuses, countries, intergovernmental bodies, etc. Still, there is something that becomes the primary locus of politics, and that is known as the state, an ensemble of effects that has control or dominion over a specific territory and its people, and is typically recognized internally and externally as having such sovereignty. So that's what we've been grappling with, this idea of the state. Now, let's look at a couple of classic definitions. So Carl Schmitt, in The Concept of the Political, says, in its literal sense and historical appearance, the state is a specific entity of a people. Vis-a-vis the many conceivable kinds of entities, it is, in the decisive case, the ultimate authority. So that's Carl Schmitt's rather conservative, thing-like definition of the state. Now, Max Weber says, a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Note, he continues, that territory is one of the characteristics of the state. Specifically, at this present time, the right to use physical force is ascribed to other institutions or to individuals only to the extent to which the state permits it. The state is considered the sole source of the, quote, right to use violence. Hence, politics for us means striving to share power or striving to influence the distribution of power either among states or among groups within a state. And this is Max Weber in Politics as a Vocation. I urge you to read this 100-year-old document. So, summing up, but also, perhaps oversimplifying some of the themes that we've been looking at, in elementary state theory, a state generally has a set of institutions of government which make up the mechanisms through which it exercises its decision-making authority. These could include the legislature and the executive, armed forces, civil service or administration, courts, and the police. The legitimacy of the state is derived from the reasonableness of its institutions. So this idea of legitimacy, it's a normative term associated with fairness. Its effectiveness is determined by the extent to which it is able to use available resources to achieve collectively desirable ends or virtue. Right? And this is also a normative idea. So coming to institutions, and a common way to define institutions is to treat them simply as organizations that persist over time. And we shall not do that in this course. I use rather a stricter definition and closer to the one that we will use in this course and elsewhere, which is to treat institutions as the noun form of the verb root to institute, i.e. to put into practice, to habituate. Thus, one meaning of institutions in the Oxford English Dictionary is, quote, the giving of form or order to a thing, orderly arrangement, regulation. Right? So related to this is an established law, custom, usage, practice, organization, or other element in the political or social life of a people, a regulative principle or convention, subservient to the needs of an organized community or the general ends of civilization. So institutions are a commonly used word, but has this slight range of meanings that, and it's important to understand what sense of institution we use in particular types of definitions and usages. The following definition of institutions is taken from Douglas North's 1993 Nobel Prize lecture. He says, institutions are the humanly devised constraints that structure human interaction. They're made up of formal constraints, rules, laws, constitutions, informal constraints, norms of behavior, conventions, and self-imposed codes of conduct, and their enforcement characteristics. Together, they define the incentive structure of societies and specifically economies. Right? How this all comes together in the institutions of government, I show in this diagram, the schematic, which I will come back to in subsequent discussions around state and development.
So Abrams describes three ways to thematize the state, indicating that one of these is doubly misleading and two are potentially useful. Right? So what are these three ways? First, a reified account of the state as a substantial unitary entity, agent, function, or relation that is separated from the rest of society and operates as the essential but hidden structuring mechanism of political life. So hint, hint, this is the one that he finds doubly misleading. Second is the state system as the real palpable nexus of institutions, agencies, and practices that is more or less extensive, more or less connected with economic and other social relations, and at best, only ever relatively unified. And the third is the state idea as an explicit ideological force, an idea force rooted in the collective misrepresentation or masking of political and economic domination in capitalist societies in ways that legitimate subjection thereto. Now, notice that Abrams is referring to the state in capitalist context, but other scholars, including Jessop, would say that this question of domination has long been a kind of domination by elite forces. And the state idea either as a kingdom or as some kind of contractual entity, this is the misrepresentation. So Jessop says that once we begin with these 2 points, A, that the state idea is a sort of masking, and B, that there's a set of institutions that serve as ways to maintain and reproduce these forms of elite domination, then we can start to understand both of these elements. Right? With these issues in mind, the present chapter introduces some definitions of the state. They've taken from different theoretical traditions. It also argues that the state and the political system are parts of broader sets of social relations and cannot be adequately understood and explained without reference to their embedding in these wider arrangements. Sovereign states do not exist in majestic isolation, overseeing the rest of society, like the image of the Leviathan might convey, but are closely linked to other institutional orders, notably the economic and legal systems, and to their respective quote-unquote civil societies. And the scare quotes signal the analogous difficulties of defining civil society, its equally contested nature, and the utopian expectations often invested in it. So very, very key paragraph that starts to summarize the rest of the argument in this essay. The state idea, Jessop says, began to take form, take shape in the early modern period, in the 15th, 16th centuries, when this notion of kingship continuing indefinitely, even if the kings came and went, began to sort of become a sort of a prevalent idea. L'État est moi, c'est moi, the state, that's me, is what Louis XIV is supposed to have said. And so that sort of reflects this notion that the state is embodied in me, but the state will continue even after I am dead. Right? So in the 15th century, the European mirror of princes literature, so this term comes up again, revealed a semantic slippage between status, estate, and state. Such treatises advised rulers how to maintain their own status, maintain a peaceful state of affairs in their dominion, and maintain a functioning state apparatus. So this term apparatus also coming up again. In turn, the natural law tradition that justified absolutism in the 16th and 17th centuries made a sharper distinction between the newly emerging single supreme sovereign authority who held office in that state and exercised power on its behalf, and the people over whom sovereign authority was exercised, whether in their own name or not. And following the same trajectory that Foucault did, going from security, territory to population and government, Jessop says the process of political institution that started to take place by the 18th, 17th, 18th centuries, the late 17th, early 18th centuries, is reflected in the contrast between Louis XIV's remark in the 17th century that he embodied the state, l'état c'est moi, and the claim to be the, quote, first servant of the state made in the 18th century by the Prussian Emperor Frederick II, who thereby sought to justify his position through deeds rather than divine right. An associated theme is that of lèse majesté, a slight or injury to the person of the sovereign and his/her immediate family, or even to the heads of other states. This idea survives in some constitutions, for example, those of Denmark, Jordan, and so on, and such slights or injuries, real or imagined, have met with punishment in dictatorships identified with a leading personality or with a tight-knit high command, for example, Myanmar's military junta. You can also extend to attacks on state symbols, for instance, by burning a national flag or by counterfeiting coins. So the state idea is well protected in its symbolic rights. Right? So this is something that is also worth noting. So moving away from looking at the state as a subject, a political subject that can feel hurt, that can feel pain, and have other affective modes, we can now ask about the plurality of subjects who act as the state's agents. This poses interesting questions in terms of principal-agent theory. So we come back to what we discussed in the last lecture. On the one hand, who is authorized to make decisions on behalf of the state as its agent and to exercise a political authority that is backed, where appropriate, by physical violence? And on the other hand, and more intriguingly, who or what constitutes the principal in this principal-agent relationship, especially in republics, where the people are supposed to be the principal? So Jessop here is pointing to things that we've already discussed in earlier parts of this module. Now, second, regarding the thingness of the state, a common response is to list its component institutions, identifying a core set with increasingly vague outer limits. The political theorist Ralph Miliband adopted this approach in a cathartic modern classic, The State in Capitalist Society. So part of what we didn't or we want to discuss in this course is a famous Miliband-Poulantzas debate, both of whom allied themselves with Marxist theories, one the English variety, the other the French structural variety. So we won't get into that debate, but Jessop's chapter actually gives us some light on the dimensions of that debate. What is interesting about the debate is that from both sides, once they started to investigate the apparatus or the thing-like properties of the state as a thing, as an entity, they started to realize that there was no longer a clear boundary between what was the public and what was the private, right? And also that being in charge of one institution, even if that is the executive branch, does not ensure control over the entire state system. So if it is a thing, it's a beast with multiple aspects and features and so on. And here, Jessop hits upon something really important. Right? So if the quality of statehood is defined in terms of such broad functions, especially where these are equated with alleged effects rather than declared purposes, why not extend the list of relevant institutions to the entire field of social relations, especially when you're running into trouble with the public-private divide, for instance. Yet, even then, they usually fail to clarify what lends the institutions in question the specific quality of statehood, and then goes on to, this is hard because, as the renowned German social scientist Max Weber noted, there is hardly an activity that modern states or their historical precursors have never undertaken, and none that they always undertake, let alone exclusively, right? So this, even thinking about modern states in some unitary functional sense falls apart. So in following this debate, Jessop hits upon something really interesting. First of all, they are both functionalist views of the state as having certain properties and having these thing-like properties and so on. But if the quality of statehood is defined in terms of their functions, especially where these are equated with alleged effects rather than declared purposes, why not extend the list of relevant institutions to the entire field of social relations? Such lists may seem more plausible when they are more restricted and correspond to everyday understandings of the state. Yet even they usually fail to clarify what lends the institutions in question the specific quality of statehood. Right? So this thing keeps plaguing us. The more we think about the state as having thing-like properties, the less satisfying that is. And going to Max Weber, Weber's alternative was to define the state initially in terms of means rather than ends, that is, in terms of the distinctive organizational form and capacities of the state apparatus, rather than its alleged functions or purposes. Thus, he defined the modern state, not, be it noted, all states, as the human community which successfully lays claim to the monopoly of legitimate physical violence within a certain territory, this territory being another of the characteristics of the state. In this context, human community refers restrictively to the administrative staff of the compulsory political organization that exercises continuous domination within a territory. So the term that I've been using from time to time, elite networks, seems to sort of capture this part of Weber's definition. Interestingly, Weber qualifies his reference to coercion by noting that states usually resort to non-violent means to secure their existence and maintain general political order in their respective territories. Who was the other scholar around the same time who came up with this non-coercive form of state action? Certainly Antonio Gramsci, who talks about hegemony, where consent is a large part of state power. And finally, crucially, what Weber initially treated as a defining feature of the modern state, its right to define the legitimate use of violence, soon disappears from his own account as he turns to bureaucracy and its crucial role in effectuating the unity of the state administration. In short, even this most famous of definitions, once introduced, was amended to allow for the complexities of real states. So wrapping it up, Weber seems to introduce these very important three elements. The three elements are of the state are a politically organized, coercive, administrative, and symbolic apparatus endowed with both general and specific powers. Right? A clearly demarcated core territory under more or less uncontested and continuous control of the state apparatus. This is the territory over which the state apparatus operates. And third, a stable and permanent population on which the state's political authority and decisions are binding. So what Jessop is saying is more than the British Marxist or French Marxist views of the state, which provided some very interesting insights, but still thought about it in thing-like terms. Weber's understanding of the bureaucracy and the state apparatus front and center, really trying to play a very important role in organizational consent and coercion making of a population, is the set of issues that one needs to really focus on. And rightly, as he says, and as I have pointed to in previous lectures, this has been the concern of many social theorists in the last 30 to 50 years. Looking now at the first of these three elements, the state apparatus, Jessop says, this phrase, that is state apparatus, designates a politically organized, coercive, administrative, and symbolic apparatus with sovereign authority vis-a-vis its own population and other states. This does not limit state power to the direct and immediate coercion, whether deployed for internal purposes or for external defense. Indeed, if most of its subjects deem state power legitimate, compliance normally follows without recourse to physical as opposed to symbolic violence, and is often mediated through micro techniques that seem to have little, if anything, to do with the state. So this is the idea of consent. So coercion needn't be actually deployed. The symbolic threat of coercion sometimes is sufficient, and even that may only lie in the background. And instead, you have all of these micro techniques that Foucault and others have been talking about. After this, he comes to the next element, state territory. While the legitimate monopoly of violence offers one entry point into the analysis of the state, another is the territorial organization of political authority. Some theorists regard this as the essential feature of the state, pre-modern as well as modern, and such territorialization of political authority certainly gives a common form to all effective states in the modern interstate system, and thereby provides an important criterion for the destatization of authority and in other contexts for state failure. In other words, the territory becomes a defining feature, a characteristic of the state, and the people without a territory are sometimes known as stateless people. It also provides a basis for distinguishing politics in general from politics that is oriented to the exercise of state power. So I'm going to skip through this. Land without centralized political authority, sometimes declared to be terra nullius, no one's land, etc. So the inverse of stateless people is a territory without people. Territorialization takes different forms, and here he gives a slightly alternative view to the one presented by James E. Scott, but nevertheless, there are some overlapping ideas here. And finally, coming to the people of a territory, the state population. To populate and population originally denoted the populating of a place or space. Regardless of nomenclature, efforts to promote this process predate the formation of chiefdoms, let alone city-states and territorial states, because people plus land were crucial economic and military resources in pre-industrial societies, right? So to have people meant that you had people to defend your territory against other states, other state formations, or one might more accurately say elite power, dominant power groupings that tried to encroach upon your territory, or as the case may be, barbarians or other encroachers from the outside. The population element of the threefold state doctrine is sometimes interpreted to connote a community of feeling, Gemeinschaft, as opposed to a shared sense of belonging to the same political association, Gesellschaft. And this has reference to work by the sociologist Stoinis, a book called Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, or Community and Society. So Gesellschaft, the latter, is a shared sense of nationhood and common citizenship based on shared duties, rights, and benefits. Jessop also says that you could have a one-sided concern with any one of these three elements. One-sided concern with state apparatus, you will lead to the kind of work produced by Tilly to focus mainly on the mafia-like organizations, the warlordism, protection brackets that define many early states. And Jessop goes on to say that all these three elements are important. In fact, he's going to introduce a fourth, and he says that focusing simply on one of these elements or two of these elements might lead you to think about state processes in slightly distorted and incomplete ways. And in the modern context, when we talk about state decline or state failure or the rolling back of the state, this can be because of failures in one or more of these three elements: the failure of state capacity, the loss of control over territory, or the dissolution of the people, the state's folk, whether through processes such as genocide, forcible removal, or demographic decline. The logical conclusion of some of this complexity is that it leads to viewing the state as being polymorphous. And he says, in the natural sciences, polymorphy signifies that a species passes through different forms in its life cycle or can assume several forms at once without having its capacity for interbreeding disruptive, or turning to chemistry, a physical compound can crystallize into two or more durable forms. Analogously, critiquing the view that states in capitalist societies are necessarily capitalist, Michael Mann has argued that the state's organization and capacities may be primarily capitalist, military, theocratic, or democratic according to the balance of forces, especially as these affect the state ensemble and its exercise of power. Its dominant crystallization is open to challenge and will vary conjuncturally. The scope for alternative crystallizations highlights the importance of the historical semantics of state formation and the variability of political imaginaries and state projects. In other words, that it depends that having a relatively coherent institutional ensemble depends crucially on the emergence of the state idea. Thus, state discourses have played a key role in the separation of the political sphere from other institutional orders, and whether as mystification, self-motivation, or self-description, still shape the state as a complex ensemble of political relations linked to their respective social formations. Right? So these crystallizations are also a way of shaping discourses about how we think and talk about the state idea. This also means that the state is not necessarily and entirely implicated in the development of capitalism. In short, the fact of competing state and societalization projects rules out that the modern state will always or could ever be essentially capitalist. Moreover, even when accumulation is deeply embedded in its organizational matrix, state managers, that is to say politicians and officials in modern states, usually consider other functional imperatives and other pressures from civil society as they try to secure the institutional integration of the state and social cohesion of their respective territories, and one should add their populations, right? So the state managers, one might say, are also, in a sense, constantly trying to recreate the story of the state idea, the narrative of the state idea. And to the extent that capitalist projects, or the projects of capitalism and the kind of frenzy and the energy of capitalism sort of steers that state idea towards a dominant narrative, that much we have seen, but that also generates various crises, as it did in 2008, and state managers are forced to sort of respond to other pressures, other elements in their within their territory and among their people. Furthermore, the state is also polycontextual. Whereas polymorphous crystallization refers to state effects derived from competing state and societalization projects, polycontextuality refers to the complexities of these effects in multiple contexts. These contexts may be embedded within each other or may exist in tangled hierarchies or both. So states and state power are both polymorphous and polycontextual, and the term polycontextual is also used. States exist at many sites and scales and undertake different sets of tasks in each context. In other words, you can make many different references, many attributes to the state: a constitutional state, cooperative state, democratic state, national state, nation state, network state, patriarchal state, security state, tax state, transnational state, welfare state, and so on. And sometimes these are overlapping, and sometimes they may appear as distinct operations of the state. So Jessop picks up on the idea that he left off a few paragraphs earlier around thinking about the state not in terms of an object or a thing, but in terms of its variable state effects. This invites concern with the changing institutional architectures and the changing activities. He says stateness, statehood, or statecraft, the arts of government, if you like, is not confined then to the exercise of sovereign power. It extends to the practices that distinguish the political from various non-political spheres, and on this basis to the complex art of governing activities that straddle these divides. And Tim Mitchell makes a very similar point. The state should be addressed, Mitchell says, as an effect of detailed processes of spatial organization, temporal arrangement, functional specification, and supervision and surveillance, which create the appearance of a world fundamentally divided into state and society. The state effect or the statecraft creates the state effect, or the effect of dividing the world fundamentally into state versus society, or state and society, as distinct entities. The essence of modern politics is not policies formed on one side of this division being applied to or shaped by the other, but the producing and reproducing of this line of difference. A very interesting observation made by Tim Mitchell, who's also written this wonderful book called The Rule of Experts. So Jessop finally comes to his own definition of the state, where he uses the three elements contributed by in Weber's arguments and adds a fourth. And he says, this is my suggestion. The core of the state apparatus comprises a relatively unified ensemble of socially embedded, socially regularized, and strategically selective institutions and organizations, whose socially accepted function is to define and enforce collectively binding decisions on the members of a society in a given territorial area in the name of the common interest or general will of an imagined political community identified with that territory. So the fourth element that he includes here is discourse or political imaginaries, which refers to this reproduction of the state idea. That said, he says this definition requires 6 qualifications, and here he talks about, for instance, this to not make this complete separation from society and institutional boundaries. They never achieve full closure. That's his first qualification. The nature of these institutions and organizations, their articulation to form their ensemble and their links with wider all depend on the nature and history of the social formation. So thinking about the historical and geographical context becomes very important, very crucial, and such distinctions are the stuff of historical sociology and comparative government. And then he says, although the third qualification, although the socially acknowledged nature of the state's political functions for society is a defining feature of normal states, the forms in which this is institutionalized and expressed vary. Again, you know, they're polycontextual, polymorphous, right? While coercion, the fourth item, he says, fourth qualification rather, while coercion is the state's ultimate sanction, a state also has other means of intervention at its disposal, both material and symbolic. Their articulation and deployment involves various contradictions and dilemmas and poses. So this is not some smooth process of coercion or completely seamless form of consent formation. There are all sorts of ways in which these are articulated, and there are multiple dilemmas, right? And number 5, the society whose common interest and general will are administered in line with the state idea is no more an empirical given than the status. So although the two are sometimes conflated in everyday discourse and theoretical work, its boundaries and identity are often constituted with the same processes by which states are built, reproduced, and transformed. This is a key aspect in defining and forming the Staatsvolk, people, the population. As an aside, the state idea, state project in this context does not refer to the general legitimation of state authority, for example, in Weberian terms, traditional, rational, legal, or bureaucratic, but to political imaginaries, to the discursive elements that present the nature and purposes of the state for the wider society in particular periods. And finally, whatever the political rhetoric of the common interest or general will might suggest, these are always illusory within quotes insofar as attempts at definition occur on a strategically biased structural and discursive terrain and involve the differential articulation and aggregation of interests, opinions, and value. So this is also an idea that is tied to the political philosopher, political scientist Robert Dahl's view of democracy, a polyarchic articulation of aggregate interests, values, and so on. The common interest or general will is always asymmetrical, marginalizing or defining some interest at the same time as it privileges others. And so this is also reflected in Philip Abrams' notion of the state idea as an important area for the development of ideology critique. And he goes on, I mean, he's a wonderful taxonomist, so he goes on to now 4 provisional lessons that can now be drawn. First, let me endorse Abrams' recommendation that we focus on the complexities of the actually existing state system and acknowledge the obfuscating role of the state idea regarding the state as a system of domination. And this is really why for the rest of this course, we're only going to be looking at case studies. We're not going to be studying all this theoretical stuff because the theoretical investigation is really showing us that having a state idea as this vague Leviathan concept in abstract terms is part of the problem. Really, we need to disaggregate the ensemble and demask the state idea, in order to try and understand the actual complexities of the existing state system. Seen in these terms, the aim of state theory should be to demystify the state, or in Michel Foucault's phrase, to cut off the king's head, by removing the sovereign state from its privileged position in political analysis. So, and this is very common in political theory. I started out this course saying that the state as a common noun appears frequently in social and political discourse. And now that we have stripped it of its tremendous identity, the identity of the Leviathan, the state, the imaginary system of the state, and start looking at its elements, its forms of sovereign power, the ways in which the state system actually operates, we prepare the ground second for a critical engagement with the state that combines historical semantics, a critique of domination, and a critique of ideology. The third preliminary lesson is that the state is a complex and polymorphous reality that is best analyzed from several entry points and standpoints, rather than by focusing one-sidedly on just one of its elements and possible crystallization. Nonetheless, and this is the fourth lesson, in order to move the analysis forward rather than remain mired in a conceptual morass, we need a preliminary definition of the state. The fourfold definition given above can provide a starting point for analysis, but this should not constitute its endpoint. Instead, what we plan to do in this course is to really stop here with thinking about the state. I have a supplementary reading for you, and that is actually something that Jessop has referenced here. I could have given you any number of supplementary or second readings this week, but I decided to really focus on this chapter so that we can sort of sum up the multiple ways of understanding the state that we have tried to arrive at from around it, so to speak. We've sort of taken a set of detours in order to arrive at this type of state definition. And now we need to really stop here and move on to look at actually existing states, and particularly in the context of human development, and see how they function, what are the different types of challenges. I'm going to actually stop right here, and we'll continue in our discussion on Thursday and Friday this week.